In the last video, we talked a bunch about scoping, and in this video, we're going to talk about closures, which is very similar to scoping. So if you've ever heard the word closure and immediately feared it because everyone said it's really difficult, we've essentially already learned everything about closures in scoping. I'm just going to reframe it in the way that makes sense, specifically around closures. So let's just take some really simple code. We're going to have a variable called a. We're just going to set it equal to 1. We're going to have a function called print, and it's just going to console.log a. And then down here, we're just going to run print. We save, it's printing out 1. That makes sense. And something interesting to think about is this is actually a closure. And the reason for that is because we have this inner scope here of the function, which we talked about in the last video. And this inner scope is accessing the variable a, which is inside of the outer scope. And something that makes this unique that you wouldn't really think about, since you know that, programs read top to bottom. So we set a equal to 1. Then we have print. So inside of print, a is 1, and then we call print. But actually, if we take a and we reassign it to 2 before we call the print function, you'll see now it prints out 2. And that's because this print function is taking whatever the most recent value of a is whenever we call the function print. So it's setting a equal to 1. Then we create the function print. It doesn't actually call it. We just create the function. And it says, okay, I have access to this variable a, which is out here. We then set a equal to 2. And then we call print, which runs this code in here to log out a, which is set to the value of 2. So this is essentially technically a closure. Now, when you think about closures, though, this is not normally what you're going to think about. Usually closures are defined as functions inside of other functions. So instead here, let's say print, and it's going to take in a variable. And then we're going to come inside of here. And we're going to have another function inside of print. And this function, it doesn't really matter what we call it. We'll just call it func. And this function here is going to console.log out variable. There we go. And actually, let's just make it take in variable 2. And we'll also do console.log variable 2. There we go. And we just want to return this function. So we'll say return function from here. So essentially what we're doing, get rid of all this extra code, is we're creating a function called print, which takes in a variable. And then this function print is returning a brand new function, which is going to log out the variable here from print, as well as a variable 2, which we pass into func. So what we can do is just come down here, we could say let a equal print, and we're going to pass this 1. So what this is doing is it's calling this print function, and this is returning to us a brand new function. So a here is a new function. So then we can call a, and we can pass it something else, for example, 2. And what this is going to do is it's going to call this function we just created, which is going to log out variable, which is this 1 we passed into print up here. And then it's going to log out variable 2, which we're getting from passing to func, which is this a function here. When we save this, you see we get 1 and then 2 being printed. And this is the textbook example of a closure, because we have this inner scope here, which has access to variable 2, and it also has access to this variable from the outer scope of this print function. We could take this a step further and create a variable. For example, we'll call this c. We'll set it equal to 3. And we come down here and we could say console.log c. And now if we save, you can see we get 1, 2, 3 being printed out, even though this variable is defined outside this function. Since JavaScript can read outside of the current scope, so we have this inner scope is reading this outer scope, it is able to access that variable c, as well as this variable here, and the variable 2, which is inside of its current scope. Now, this idea of closures like this is probably not something you're going to run into too often when you're writing your own code, but a lot of times you're going to get interview questions where they're going to give you code just like this, and they're going to ask you, what is this going to log out? And if you understand how scope and closures work and the fact that you can always read things outside of where you are, but you can never read things inside, it's fairly straightforward to see that this function here called func has access to c and variable since they are outside of func and it's not trying to drill into anything else. Now that's really all there is to closures. I covered most of the stuff you need to know about closures in the scoping section. It's just when you think of closures, the word, generally people return to functions inside of functions very similar to this. Now in the next section, we're going to be going over variables again, but we're going to be going over the advanced concepts related to variables. So far we've talked about numbers, strings, and the let keyword, but there's a few more advanced variable types that I need to cover, so we're going to talk all about those in the next section. I cannot wait to see you there.